Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about A Course in Miracles and non-duality. Are they the same? We've been wanting to do this podcast for a while now because A Course in Miracles and non-duality very often are viewed as the same thing. And it's easy to see why. In the end, both paths teach that everything is one and separation is an illusion. But there are some very significant differences as well. And so we wanted to do this episode to draw out what we consider to be fundamentally different worldviews. Couple of notes of housekeeping as we get started. I should say here at the beginning that our goal with this podcast is not to critique non-duality in and of itself. It is a very serious spiritual path with many followers, and we very much want to respect that. In addition, Robert and I are not practitioners of non-duality. We have put in a lot of time and research to prepare for this episode over the course of a few years now, but we have carefully structured our discussions so as not to exceed the limits of our knowledge and our understanding. And we really want to be fair. And because of that, it's worth noting that we're not drawing upon the more radical non-dual Netherlands. The Course has its own Netherlands, so we understand that it gets pretty wild out there, and we're not going over there. Instead, we are basing our views around the more centrist teachings of non-duality from Eckhart Tolle, Adyashanti, Rupert Spira, and philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, for example. There are obviously a lot more non-dual teachers out there, but this is mainly where we're drawing our understanding from. The structure of this episode is that we are going to present a very general 10,000-foot contrast between non-dual teachings and the teachings of A Course in Miracles. Then we're going to drill down into some fundamental differences related to the self and God. And we're going to talk about the idea of whether A Course in Miracles simply uses dualistic language to lead us all to a non-dual truth. And we're going to end with what the Course specifically says about personhood, about relationship to others, free will, and more. Robert, I have to admit, I am nervous about this episode. I think it's an important thing to talk about. I think it's an important thing to get clear on. But there is a real heart connection to non-duality in parts of the Course community. And I think some of what we're going to talk about today is going to be a surprise and maybe even difficult to take in.
I think the reason that we have some trepidation is that we sincerely don't want to be disrespectful. We just want to make an important distinction between these two different approaches. And for those who are open, we think it's going to be a helpful distinction.
So in the interest of not burying the lead, we want to begin by making this as simple as possible. So, Robert, what is the bare bones contrast between A Course in Miracles and the teachings of non-duality?
In non-duality, as the word tends to be understood these days, what's real is only infinite awareness without distinction. And that means you, as an individual, are an illusion. Your real nature is your just infinite awareness. And what that means is there are no selves in the usual sense, no persons to think and choose and act. We'll say more about that. God doesn't have a self like that, and you don't either. In contrast, in the Course, reality is made up of what we're going to be calling here unbounded persons, meaning individuals that have selfhood, that think and choose and act God has that kind of selfhood, and so do you. But these persons have no boundary in reality, no body, and are one with each other. So paradoxically, they are individual and yet united, and they are one and yet in relationship. And through this view, the Course grants reality and value and free will and much more to each individual. And it grants reality to relationship between individuals.
So, to be super concise, both paths agree that reality is unified, that reality is one. Both paths agree that separation is an illusion. I mentioned all of that in the intro. But there's a very basic difference in that non-duality sees no self at all, whereas the Course sees nothing but selves, although in their true nature, they're boundless and unified.
Right. And that distinction's everything.
Okay. So to begin a comparison of non-duality and the Course, we thought it would be best to drill it all down to these two fundamental concepts of God and the self and talk about them from both sides. So starting with God, in non-dual teachings, what you find is that what we traditionally understand as God isn't how it really is. In non-dual teachings, there is a single ultimate reality that is often called boundless awareness, pure awareness, or infinite consciousness. It's called God sometimes, but more often it's called by these other names. So let's talk about this non-dual reality as infinite consciousness and how that differs from the Course's view of God.
This is a fundamentally important distinction because God in these teachings, and it is called God sometimes, but usually not, is not personal. God is just pure beingness. Sometimes it's even called emptiness or nothingness. Um, God or infinite awareness does not have a will, does not have a plan, does not have intentions. It doesn't do things. And I've never heard it described as a creator. And you could see that that really wouldn't follow to call this God, this infinite awareness, a creator. And rather than being good and loving, this God is said to be beyond dualistic concepts like good versus evil, light versus darkness, love versus hate. So rather than being one side of those polarities, it's beyond both polarities, beyond both good and evil.
So let's also talk about this idea of ourselves. What is the nature of the self in your understanding of non-duality, and how does that relate to the Course?
Okay, well, I think we'll talk more about the course later, but the idea in non-duality, and again, we're trying to lump together a lot and we're resting upon, the best understanding we can glean, but we are simply that undifferentiated, limitless awareness. We're the whole thing. And we as an individual are an illusion. And the best analogy that I've heard from my standpoint is that we're like a whirlpool in water. This comes from philosopher Bernardo Kastrup. And what he says is that we as individuals are like a whirlpool. If you think about a whirlpool, what is it? It's not an entity, right? It's just this temporary localized activity that will soon, like whirlpools, eventually, you know, vanish, relax, and just turn back into the water they always were. So we are like those whirlpools. We as individuals are not real. What's real is just the body of water. And ultimately, we are that whole body of water.
That whirlpool idea is really helpful because it makes it clear that this idea that we aren't really separate, that the sense of being separate is an illusion created by the mind. It's the mind's thinking and concepts that creates the illusion, which means that in the path of non-duality, separation is a story told by the mind. Um, and we talk a lot here about the mind being the bad guy in so much of contemporary spirituality, that rather than facilitating the process of our spiritual growth, oftentimes it's viewed as an impediment to it. And this is an example of that, isn't it?
It is. In fact, I think that you wouldn't even talk about spiritual growth in a non-dual concept. You're not trying to grow, you're trying to subtract, right?
So, if we go back to the idea that our sense of self is an illusion, if there's literally no individual you, then that has major implications for every aspect of our life. So, let's talk about those implications.
Yes, and I think this is where it's easy to be acquainted with non-dual teachings and not realizing what's actually being said and how far it actually goes. And that's been my experience. I haven't realized just how radical the idea is. So the idea here is that in terms of a self, you have no self. You literally have no self. You're not a person. The idea of you as a person, either a combination of physical and mental, or even a purely mental person, that's just a construct of your mind. In terms of your thinking, you don't generate your thoughts. And you should already get that from what I just said, because there's no you to be thinking. There's no thinker. Okay, so how could you think up your thoughts? Your thoughts just arise from the totality of conditions and circumstances, internal and external. Free will. You don't have free will. Again, you should already get that. There is no you to exercise free will. Your choices, your sense of free will is an illusion. Your choices just arise spontaneously. Okay. Doer. There is no doer, right? Once we said there's no self, we said all these things implicitly. So there's no doer in you. Actions just arise, they just happen. No one's doing them. And it's taken me a long time to get all of that. Like, oh, okay. So this is why this person, like, I have a lot of respect for Bernardo Castro. That's why he doesn't seem to believe in free will, because, like, how can you when there's no person, there's no self to be exercising that freedom?
Okay, so no self, no thinker, no chooser, no doer.
Right.
And so rather than thinking better thoughts and making better choices, what the non-dual path is leading you to is to cease to identify with your thoughts and recognize the underlying awareness that is prior to thought, and to identify with the infinite consciousness that is beneath the thinking mind.
Right. So the real, just to boil it all the way down, the essential view here is that both on the level of God and the level of us, there are no selves. No one has a self. No one has personhood. No one's there to do the thinking, choosing, and doing. So God is not a self that thinks, chooses, and acts. You are not a self that thinks, chooses, and acts. There are no selves. Reality is empty of all that. It's just undifferentiated consciousness that abides and in which things mysteriously arise. I'm not sure how they arise. There's a lot of talk about that in various videos, but things just arise without anybody doing them, either the self, pure beingness, or you, because there's no you to do them.
I feel like there's so much more that we could unpack there, but just in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and turn to the teachings of A Course in Miracles and start with the same place, with God. What is the big picture overview of God in the Course?
Well, the Course's God is more similar to the Christian God than it is to the non-dual God, I would say. It's fair to call the Course's God a personal God, a being you can relate to as a person. In the Course, God thinks, God wills, God loves, God plans, God creates, God has relationships. The Course says he created us because he wanted a relationship. Quote, he did not will to be alone. So even though God in the Course is absolutely infinite, without body, without boundary, without ego, not like some cranky old guy who's wrathful and all that, he's pure love. He's still talked about as a he, as if he's a being, a person.
Yeah, and a lot of people take issue with the idea that God in the Course is described as he. And we all know that God is beyond gender, but calling God he rather than it or the universe does reinforce this idea in the Course that God has some sense of personhood. He's unbound, no body, no boundaries, no limit. But at the same time, if we think of God as unconditional love stretched to infinity, one thing that you said is that it might be even better to think of him as an unconditional lover stretched to infinity. And that sounds a little weird, but at the same time, it does incorporate this idea of relationship with him. So that's key. That's huge in the Course, is having a relationship with God.
I feel like one last thing I should add to the God discussion is that in the Course, God is not beyond good and evil, light and dark, love and hate. In the Course, God has no opposite, but it's because he is light without opposite. He is good without opposite. He is love without opposite. So he's still beyond opposites, but that's because he's one of each polarity stretched to infinity, and the opposite side of that is completely gone. So it's a very different view of beyond opposites.
Well, yeah, and we were talking about that earlier this morning, that if you have moral and immoral, then what's beyond that is amoral. So, do you really want a God that's amoral, that is neither good nor bad, but nothing? Okay, so let's get back to the self. So we've covered God in A Course in Miracles. Let's get into the self. What does the Course say about the nature of our self?
In the Course, God creates us. It's an intentional act. He does not want to will to be alone as extensions of his own being. So we are like carbon copies. The Course calls us sons of God. We are chips off the old block. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And like God, we have a self. We have the faculties of thought, will, and creativity. A word I'd like to use is we are subjects, as well as agents. Is a phrase that Donald Hoffman, who I listen to sometimes, uses. Conscious agents. We are conscious agents. But like God, we are unbounded. So we don't have a boundary. We don't have a body. We are one with God, even part of God, and one with all the other sons of God, and yet we are ourselves as well, which is a paradox that these brains have a hard time wrapping themselves around.
Just as in non-duality, the core in the Course, separateness is a concept. It's a belief. We believe that we are separate from God and from each other, and this belief manifests as a body that seemingly makes separation real. The difference with the Course, though, is that there is an actual agent. There's an actual self that is believing it's separate. And this self does think, it does choose, it does act. It has just done that wrongly from the Course's perspective and with negative consequences, negative repercussions. It's a false belief that has resulted in us finding ourselves in these bodies and all the suffering that comes with that. And so the way out in the course is to take the agency that got you in the body and use it to transcend the body by thinking better, choosing better, doing better. Yeah.
Exactly. And what that means is those faculties are not inherently egoic, the faculties of thought and choice and action. Um, they swing both ways. They can get us into illusion and they get us out. They wake us up.
Since our distinct self is real in the course, that means that we're also in relationship with other real selves. Again, we're in relationship with God, relationship with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus, with other people, even angels. So reality is one, but it has all of this multiplicity in it.
Extremely rich multiplicity. The Course talks about just God's creations as being, quote, in number infinite. So they're all one. They all contain the whole within themselves. And yet, as parts, they are in number infinite.
You and I were cracking up because Rupert, very famous non-dual teacher, was read the final lessons of the workbook of A Course in Miracles, the one that says, "This holy instant would I give to you, be you in charge, for I would follow you, certain that your direction brings me peace." And then the lesson ends with, "And he will hear and answer me because he speaks for God, my Father, and his Holy Son." And Rupert's response was, wow, there's four entities in that one paragraph. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. There's God, there's the Holy Spirit, there's the reader, me, there's God's Son. So again, there's this clear difference between non-duality and the Course. There are distinct entities in the course. We are one, yes, but there is distinction within the oneness, and our minds just don't have a category for that yet.
It's true. Um, as we'll say more later, I love this vision of reality. It's a different vision, though. Reality as composed of unbounded persons with power and worth and dignity and creativity and love that are themselves, that are individual, and yet paradoxically one with each other. So this includes God as well as his creations. God and his creations, they are thinkers, even in heaven. They think in eternity. They have wills. They are inherently dynamic. They are creators, even in eternity. They are dynamic and creative. They are one with each other, and yet, even in eternity, they are in relationship. So the idea of oneness and at the same time, relationship is another one of those paradoxes that we don't really have much of a groove for laid down in our minds right now.
I I agree, and I'm just thinking about this idea that is very common in course circles, that A Course in Miracles uses dualistic language to lead us to a non-dual truth. And I imagine that there's a lot of people who are watching and listening who are thinking that very thing. The Course does say, for example, that heaven is an awareness of perfect oneness. And since we all know that the Course is leading us to heaven, it's easy to assume that the Course is leading us to a place that is ultimately non-dual.
Without
Students
any
will,
distinctions.
yeah, no distinctions. So when you're saying that we're thinking even in heaven, I imagine that that's confusing for some, because many students will say, for example, that the course remains within the ego framework, but the real show is what is beyond and beneath that framework. I imagine that there's people listening who are like, Robert and Emily are really stuck in level confusion right now. And there's a lot of discussion that the course is the stepping stone to the real thing, and the real thing is direct awakening to pure awareness. And so I want to talk about that idea that, well, I'll just leave it there. I know that's
Yeah.
not your view, so just say more about that.
Yeah, we could do a month of podcasts about that. What I will say, just in brief, this is its own whole topic. I've been actively looking at this issue since I think 1985. I used to correspond with Ken Wapnick, and he used to send me these audio tapes, and in one
Which
of
is
the audio,
adorable, by
yeah,
the
well,
way.
it's a time saver, little cassette tapes. Um,
We do
and
that
what,
now on our phones, but the fact that
yeah,
you have cassette tapes, anyway.
yeah. So, in the tape he was like, well, actually the Holy Spirit is just a metaphor for our own memory of God's love. And I was like, what? I mean, you kind of grasp pretty instantly that means there is no Holy Spirit if he's just a metaphor for your memory of being with God. I've been looking at this issue for almost 40 years now, and what I will say is that can look easily like the profound option. Like the Course is just using this dualistic Christian language, but it's real. The real meaning is underneath. And there's another way to look at that, and that is that the Course always speaks within the worldview that we've just talked about. Reality being composed of unbounded persons that are in some sense individual and yet also one. Always talks that way, never lets up. Um, and it does so using its most technical terms. And so and it never suggests that it doesn't mean it. It never says, well, this is just a metaphor. It's just consistently within that worldview in every line. And so at that point, to say, well, it really means something else, in my mind, is it something we humans do a great deal, but it's a refusal to let it have its own voice. It just keeps saying the same thing, and we're like, no, you don't mean that. What you really mean is this. And I always think about these analogies. If we were to do this in ordinary communication, it would be considered very disrespectful. If I was a waiter, way back in the day I was, and you said, you want the burger, and I said, oh, okay, I get it. That's a metaphor. You want the stir fry. You wouldn't be happy with me. And so, without going into great length, what I can say is the Course absolutely means it when it communicates the worldview we've been talking about, because it never lets up. Okay. It always talks that way. We either need to accept that that's what it's teaching, or in my view, I think we just need to say, I don't agree. The Course had it wrong, which is perfectly fine. But I think to say it's really expressing this whole other worldview is simply a refusal to let it have its voice.
It's really tempting and seductive to think that, okay, there's the Course is this thing, but then there's this other thing, and that's the real thing. And you and I even flirted with that for a while, the idea that the Course is using this dualistic language to point us all to a non-dual truth. And that
Well, I'll just
is,
clarify. I had a little bit of playing, a subtle amount of playing with that a very long time ago. So I don't want people to think
Robert
that
had
you and me
slight
together.
footsie. Robert had slight footsie with non-duality many years ago.
Well, the way it
We'll
sounded
leave it
was like
there.
just like last year, we were like, anyway.
No, I just mean on our own separate paths, because you and I had very similar spiritual paths, even though we didn't know each other. We grew up Christian, left Christianity, looking for something deeper, flirted with this idea that this is the truest truth, and then came back to the Course because of all the richness and because the relationships just felt more real. But this perception that there's the Course and then there's the truth is the very thing that we're trying to unwind in this podcast, because there's this pervasive idea that there's a Course in Miracles underneath the non-dual path of pure awareness, that there's what we're trying to say is that there's the course and there's the non-dual path of pure awareness. These are not stacked. These are two separate tracks. And some people will disagree with this, I know, but to a significant degree, I think the course community has ceded a lot of ground and said, okay, well, I guess the course really is that stepping stone to the real truth of pure awareness, that these are stacked, that there's level one is the course, and level two is non-duality. And we're just trying to unwind that with this episode by saying they're not stacked, they're separate worldviews, fundamentally different worldviews.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to think that, well, obviously that's dualistic, Christian, often poetic and metaphorical language. It's beautiful. But even though it seems kind of superficial, underneath it is the real non-dual stuff. And we're saying that's not the case. Um, Different worldviews. Okay, one thing that I feel like I've picked up a lot is the non-dualists kind of put out this message that, well, I mean, truth has to be beyond human concepts and stories, and therefore the real truth must be non-dual, or else it's just a bunch of human concepts and stories. And then there's the suggestion of, well, maybe you aren't ready for the real thing. Like you've got to you know, keep playing with your dualistic toys, and maybe one day you'll be ready for the real thing. And I want to say a few things about that perspective. What I want to say is we're simply talking about different worldviews here. Everyone thinks their worldview is true. If they didn't, they'd be somewhere else, right? Everyone thinks their worldview is higher. And I feel like everyone wants to claim the high ground. I feel like the non-dualists, it means this is just my perception, but I feel like they've been really successful in getting away with what amounts to ordinary one-upmanship, the kind everyone's always been doing, right? The Christians are like, you got to believe in Jesus, you go to hell forever. We all engage in one-upmanship, but I feel like they've somehow pulled it off without looking like they're doing the thing everybody else does. And what I want to say is because we all claim that our worldview is like the truth, the highest truth, that just needs to be skimmed off the top and removed from the conversation. Um, we simply have different worldviews here. And it's not that the non dualists are beyond concepts and beyond a story. They're telling their story, they're communicating their concepts. Obviously, it's a series of concepts. If you can say it and your dog doesn't understand what you're talking about, you're conveying concepts. You're telling a story. And then the issue is simply which story, which set of concepts, which worldview most closely mirrors reality. And I think the appropriate position was, in theory, either one could, right? Reality, in theory, could be undifferentiated awareness. Reality could, in theory, be a transcendental community of unbounded persons in unity with each other. Reality could just be matter and energy, like most scientists believe. It could be all those things. Let's not get out of the gate and say, well, obviously, from the get-go, mine is the deepest and highest and truest. And, and if you can't handle that, then you just aren't ready for the truth. We should approach it as an open question. We Course in Miracles students, we have our story. Non-dualists have their story. The scientific materialists have their story. Let's just be open to what reality really is. Some stories are better than others. It's okay if we admit that yours is a story too. You might have the best story, but let's be open-minded.
I hear what you're saying. I like that language of let's just get out of the zone of I've got the real truth and just get into the zone of here's what I believe, here's why I believe it, and we can talk about that and find some common ground where we can, but understand that there are different worldviews where we do as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about, so often we hear that this is beyond concepts, or that is beyond concepts, but I, that in itself is a concept. So there's that, and then there's also we have someone who just left a study group saying that they were beyond words. Well, how did you say that? Like, you used words. And so these things are kind of easy to talk about, right? Like, you used words to say that you were beyond words. You used the concept to say that you're beyond concepts. However, there is one thing that is a bit of a showstopper, um, and that is when someone will use their own spiritual experience to confirm the truth of non-dualism, or whatever it is that they're trying to confirm. Someone will say, look, I have been in the state of no self. I have been on the other side. I've seen it. I've seen the truth. And now this is my entire picture of things. So how do we reckon with that?
Yeah, I think those claims are important and interesting. What I would say, though, I've been in the spiritual thing for a lot of years now. Every tradition conditions the mind, and every tradition conditions and trains the mind to have experiences that are in alignment with that tradition's framework. And hey, guess what? People in those traditions have the experiences they are trained and conditioned to have. So if you've been sitting around, listening to your non-dual teacher for a week or for a weekend or whatever, and then you go out and have a non-dual experience, we're not particularly surprised. Of course you do. Of course you do. People in more dualistic Eastern traditions will have more dualistic experiences. Their minds have been conditioned. What I find interesting, and this is one of the reasons I believe in the Course's worldview, and one of the reasons I allowed myself to go with its language. I had been sort of in my mind blunting its more personal language, and that's near-death experiences. Because here you have millions of people who have not necessarily been conditioned in any tradition, but you have millions of people who they haven't taken a drug, they haven't done a spiritual practice, they just got hit by a car or just had a heart attack, and they go over and have an account of the other side. And in that account, they experience a reality strikingly consistent with each other and strikingly reminiscent of the Course's worldview. You know, persons who are somehow individual and yet also one. I mean, we could talk a lot about the details here. Um, I find it interesting that unconditioned millions go over to the other side when they get hit by a car, have an experience of a reality that's not the reality their culture says is true, but looks just like the Course's. And so for me, for reasons like that and others, I personally believe that the way the Course describes reality is real. I personally believe the story of non-duality is not as good of a story. It less accurately mirrors reality. Now, that's not what the podcast is about, but I do think it's quite legitimate to not cede that territory to the non-dualist, like not say, yeah, okay, that's got to be true, but I'm just not ready for it yet. You can robustly say, that's great, that's your path. I've got another worldview, and I really affirm the rightness of my worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you were saying a minute ago about the experiences that people have oftentimes will reinforce the things that they believe in. Um, that's fascinating to me, because my own spiritual experiences, shamanic, uh, psychedelic experiences under well-controlled environments, ceremonial environments with professionals, um,
Hmm.
are interesting because they've been the most powerful. However, they have reinforced my belief that there is an unbounded individual. I was still me without the body, yet at one with everything. So here we are, right back where we started. I'm
Can I
having
just inject
experiences
though?
that reinforce my beliefs. Other people are having experiences that reinforce their beliefs. And here we are at the beginning with these foundationally different worldviews. And all we have
Yeah,
is our experiences.
yeah.
So go ahead.
I think I'm gonna pass. I'm gonna take us off into a tangent. So keep going.
Well, now I'm curious about your, we can cut it, but I'm curious, what's your tangent?
Well, I mean, people who take a strong enough dose of psychedelics often have like the total undifferentiated consciousness, no self experience. Is that the thing to trust the most? Is that because the drug has knocked out their default mode network? Is that a chemical thing? Personally, I trust the more kind of unbounded person reality that people experience in NDEs. You can have, though, people who say, yeah, you take a strong enough dose of psychedelics and you're going to get that non-dual worldview. I mean, Stanislav Grof was saying that kind of thing decades ago.
Oh, so you're
So,
saying I just didn't take enough? Is that it?
so I
That's the
just
bottom line
thought
here.
that like muddies the waters.
It does muddy the water a
Yeah.
little bit, but I do, you're never going to get around, we can talk about personal experiences, we can talk about whatever, but you're never going to get around the fact that in the course, Rupert's right. You are dealing with a lot of entities. You are dealing with a lot of distinction within the oneness. And so, really, the bottom line, what we're getting at here is, um, if the course is your path, work within that path. And if non duality is your path, work within that path. To try and conflate them will just result in confusion, and we're all getting home in the end. So it's not like one is
Yeah.
higher, we're not saying that, but just if it would be helpful and in furtherance of your journey if you stayed in the lane that you're in with your path. Sorry, I,
Yes.
I really tripped over that. I'm trying to be so careful here, but
I
yeah.
think that what we're trying to say is if you're a Course in Miracles student, if you really believe it's your path, then respect it as a path. If you say that what's really under the hood is non-duality, you are going to fundamentally distort the Course. You're going to strip out core elements, and you're going to bring in elements from outside that aren't really in the Course. So whatever your path is, respect it.
Okay, that was well said. Thank you for all of that. Let's end here by switching gears a bit and talking about the positive elements of the course's worldview that are unique to it. Now, you were saying earlier that everyone is on their path because they believe in the truth in it. And it is kind of a low blow to say, well, we have the higher truth. And if you're not with that, then it's because you're not ready to understand it yet. So we were saying earlier that the approach to this conversation is to say, here's my path, here's why I believe in it, and I believe in it for these fundamental reasons. And so we have those reasons ourselves with the course. We believe it has an enormous amount to offer, both to us as individuals and to the world. Everyone thinks that about their path. And so we want to end with some of the positive benefits of the course's path.
Yes, I do. We could spend a long time talking about the benefits of that unfamiliar, paradoxical worldview of reality being almost like this community of transcendental persons who are themselves and yet one. I think I personally feel there's such beauty in that, even if we don't have the grooves laid down in our minds.
Okay, so the first item on our list of what the course has to offer is about personhood and selfhood. In the course, you get to be a self, just a self that is at one with the whole, a self that mistakenly believes that it's separate, but still a distinct being, an entity that is a self. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and I think what the benefit here is that valuing oneself is a central issue. If you don't value yourself, I think we know all that comes out of that. You get depressed. Life becomes empty. So it's a huge positive in the course that we get to have a basis for valuing ourselves that goes all the way down to fundamental reality. In the course, we are eternally sons of God, and we have what it calls inestimable value. I was just reading this line from the course this morning that says, "You could not make yourself unworthy because you are the treasure of God." So here, valuing ourselves rests on eternal reality, valuing ourselves as individuals. Uh, it has a kind of ultimate foundation, and that's a huge positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the course is very big on the exalted self, but it's the self as our true nature as God created us. And that's,
Right.
yeah,
So the
okay.
idea is the self that I am, that's making my choices, generating these words. I think it's a human self full of flaws, um, but it's actually an eternal son of God asleep and delusional and thinking it's not itself. But that's what I am. I am that eternal son of God. And so I have limitless value.
So also in the course, you not only get to be a self, but you get to be a thinker. The idea is just to be a better one, be a better thinker. In the course, thinking is the facilitator of spiritual awakening. Um, Meditation is a big part of the course's path. So thinking isn't always the case. The course does talk about going beyond words. It talks about resting in God. But for the most part, what we're doing in the course is we are using the practice to reason ourselves into a higher state. And so what the course is offering is a very, very positive view of the mind and a positive view of thinking itself.
That's true. And as you know, I'm very fond of that element of the course. I don't think we can really get around the importance of thinking. Thinking is how we represent reality, and you could call it our user interface. So, whatever reality is, and we're all trying to discover that, we interface with it through our thoughts. So, that means the problem is not thinking, it's wrong thinking. And the solution is, as you said, better thinking, more accurate representations of reality, a better user interface. Course calls that right thinking. In fact, I found a quote here that says about God, you must think as he thinks if you are to know him again. And that says a lot. And one thing I think this implies is that even if you are a non-dual teacher and you consider yourself fully awake, your thoughts are still your user interface. So if you have thoughts that are irrational, that are biased, that are egocentric, that favor you and not others, it's through those thoughts that you'll relate to your world so that while you're thinking, "Hey, I'm super awake," you won't be getting along with others, and it'll always be their fault. Okay? We can't get around thinking as our user interface with reality, so we need better thinking.
The course also talks about free will, and it talks about how it's our choice to separate that got us here. I mentioned earlier it's our choice. It's our choice to be attached to the ego that got us into these bodies and the resultant pain and suffering that comes with that. And it's our choice to go home. Um, in our Jesus course this week, we even shared that passage in the course where Jesus says, and I'm completely paraphrasing here, I am trying to teach you the perfect equality of the sonship. And Jesus is like, I'm trying to teach you your perfect equality with me, but I can't teach you that if I make your choices for you, if I violate your free will. He's saying, I can't teach you equality if I use dominion to do that. So here's this idea of choice and agency. And that's very big in the course as well.
It's huge. And I think the fact is, this is where it's odd because if you watch non-dualist videos, they're talking a great deal about what goes on in your mind. And in my view, what goes on in our mind is that everyone has a direct experience of choosing and willing. And that's why I like some things that the political philosopher and linguist Noam Chomsky says about free will. He says he doesn't know what free will is, but he says everyone, without exception, even staunch opponents of free will, always act as if they have free will. And my view is it's because that's a direct experience. We're experiencing ourselves willing, saying, I'm going to go right rather than left. And at the, and in addition to that, I think it's hugely important for us to kind of get that faculty in hand, so to speak. I think mostly what we do is impulses arise, habit patterns, unconscious conditioning arises, and we're the doorman, and we're supposed to be saying, you don't get into the nightclub tonight, and we're just letting it all through. We need to reclaim that faculty of free will and use it because we can use it to set ourselves in a new direction, to make a new choice. So I feel like the course's emphasis on us having the faculty of free will is a real positive because we need to use that faculty rather than having the doorman be asleep and just letting all the impulses just happen and walk through. We can change everything if we will use our free will.
And you could say that about any of the positive elements that we've discussed so far. So you can say that about reclaiming a sense of self. You can say that about reclaiming thinking, reclaiming free will. And you can also say that about this next one that we're going to talk about, which is doing.
Mhm.
The next positive element in the course's thought system, in our view, is doing. Um, doing. This is another one that gets completely downplayed in contemporary spirituality, both non-dual and otherwise. We often hear, how often have we heard that we are human beings, not human doings? But the Course grants full place to the idea of doing.
It does. And this has been an adjustment for me over the years because coming from a more kind of Eastern influenced spirituality, I would naturally think of heaven as this, you're just abiding, right? It's just a receptive kind of passive thing. And the Course has a view of who we are, of heaven, eternity, and of this earth in which doing, dynamism, self-expression, function, creativity are all a part of the very fabric of our being. So it says that in heaven, in eternity, we create. We don't create form, we create spirit. It says on earth, we still have that impulse. So we feel a need to have a function, to make a contribution, to make a difference, to express ourselves, to exert creativity. And we need that. Something in us dies if we're useless. And so the course says that that's part of us. And not only do we do that in heaven, but we do that to get back to heaven. From its view, we need to express that impulse in the form of love, in the form of being a healer, in the form of being a force of salvation in the world. And that actually wakes us up. So part of how we wake up in the Course is through right doing. We have to do better.
So we're getting to near the end here, but another category that we wanted to talk about is this idea of relationship, the recognition of the self, meaning that we are distinct, we think, we choose, we will, we do. This is what allows us to be in real relationship with real other people. And that's a major theme in the Course. The Course is incredibly other oriented. It's constantly leading us to a place where we are granting other people full holiness, equality, and worth. Its central teaching is forgiveness. So it's trying to get us to that place where we're becoming clear channels for the expression of love in the world. That's what a miracle is. This is a course in the expression of love to other people. And that's a very beautiful thing because relationship is one of our greatest joys in life.
It absolutely is. And here in the Course, it's real. The relationship we do on Earth is not, nothing on Earth is real, but it's a mirror of the fact that in heaven, relationship is fully real. It's paradoxically oneness and yet relationship. And in the Course, we learn our way out of ego by being able to engage in egoless relationships. So the more I care about you, the more I'm wanting to know how I can be a healing influence for you. What's going on with you? Who are you? Um, the more I'm other oriented, the more I step out of ego. And I think that's the best test of of egolessness, frankly. Um, so in the Course, we don't just express love once we wake up through expressing love, through engaging in egoless relationship. And frankly, I think this is what the world needs. We're already really good at treating other people as if they aren't fully real. We're really good at dehumanizing other people and acting like they're nothing. Okay. I think we need a path that expressly sends us in the opposite direction, where we more and more tune into and honor and respect and care for, tend to the reality of others.
Yeah, that's well said. One of the things that we always talk about here is how the evolution of the world has been this slow march towards granting other people greater and greater human rights. But what if we could have a world where we do the march to granting people more and more divine rights, understanding who they really are as equal to us on the level of our creation and through God.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So just as the Course is always pointing us towards the reality of the ultimate reality of other people, it's also pointing us to the ultimate reality of God and to relationship with God, as we've been saying. And for Course students, many of us like the idea that we've been created by something higher, that there is a God and that he is infinitely good. And we need that. I think it's more than just liking it. I think we need it because we need something higher than ourselves to pull us to a higher place.
Well, and think about it. I mean, there's so much joy we experience when relationship works, and you want to be in relationship with someone who is real and who is good, right? Therefore, wouldn't the best thing to be in relationship with God, who is perfectly good, who is the summit of reality? And I think that, what mystics have said throughout the ages is there is this longing in our hearts to be with God. And in the Course, that means in relationship with God, and it means one with God. It means both at the same time. And so I think one of the pluses of the Course is it does encourage us to cultivate a relationship with God. I one time cataloged the fact that the Course mentions relationship with God 40 times. Um, Meditation, it talks about as a collaboration with God, not just a solitary thing. The Course talks a lot about prayer, in which we talk to God. And I think that dimension of entering into loving relationship with God on this earth as kind of preparation for the total relationship relationship slash union with God in eternity is a big plus in the Course.
The Course is just leading us to this place where we're ultimately meant to transcend the ego. And we do that by learning how to be in egoless relationship. The Course came to teach us how to get along. And that means get along by learning that egolessness with other people and in our relationship with God.
It's a
So,
different account of egolessness. You know, one account is I look inside and I report to you that I don't see a doer, I don't see a thinker, I don't see a chooser. The other is I don't report to you my state so much as I ask you about your states.
let's close. When you and I were talking about the big picture here, you were saying that part of what you love about the Course is that it strips away all of the painful elements of life. And then it takes what's left, the positive elements of life, and magnifies them to a limitless degree. And I think that's a good summarization of all that we've discussed. So let's end with that. Share with everyone what you were saying to me this morning about that.
Yeah, I think that taking the negative elements of life, feeling separate, feeling afraid, all that stuff in conflict, and stripping those away, which you find in non-duality, that's freedom, that's liberation. Okay. But I think that's half of the equation. The Course takes the positive elements of life. I mean, our society, for good reasons, considers personhood to be sacred. We don't carry that out all the time, but that intuition is behind so many of our traditions and laws. The Course takes personhood, it takes relationship between persons, and it just magnifies all that to a limitless degree. So we aren't just getting freed of the negative elements of life, important as that is. We're also having the positive elements magnified, as you said, to a limitless degree. And I think that is extremely valuable.
Again, as always, there's so much more that could be said, but we hope that this has been a beneficial podcast. As I said in the beginning, I imagine it's different, it's surprising, it's a lot to take in, because there is again that heart connection with non-duality and the Course. You hear when someone describes A Course in Miracles, immediately, A Course in Miracles is a non-dual path that and so there is this coupled nature of the Course and non-duality, and we think that the Course and non-duality would benefit from uncoupling those things and treating them as separate paths versus a stacked one leading to the other. So we'll end it there. Thank you to all who have watched or listened to this podcast. We very much welcome your feedback in the comments section or in our community, our free online community. If you're not a member of that community, you're welcome to join us at community.circleofa.org. Inside, you'll find over 5,000 Course friends from around the world who are all walking this path with you. And you'll also find links to all of our free gatherings. We host sacred silence gatherings, these live podcast recordings, and Sunday gatherings. And there's much more inside that free community. And you're invited to join us at community.circleofa.org. On behalf of Robert and I and all of us at the Circle of Atonement, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you next time. Bye for now.